Alright, this will be a video about 4 novels that eerily predicted major world events, and these are books that have some really fascinating connections and similarities to events like the Oklahoma City bombing, the JFK assassination, Trump's presidency. Yet these books were written years or even decades before these events. So we'll get into it, and first up is The Final Jihad by Martin Keating, which is a novel that was written in the early 1990s that has just a ton of really uncanny similarities with details of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1997. And this book is about a terrorist cell in Oklahoma that's planning on bombing federal buildings and carrying out terrorist attacks in the US. And one of the really curious things about the book is that there's a character named Tom McVeigh. And obviously, this name is nearly identical to Tim McVeigh, who was the man who was eventually blamed for the Oklahoma City bombing and given the death sentence. So that's definitely a strange parallel. And there's also another part in the book that takes place right after a building is bombed, where an Oklahoma State trooper pulls over one of the terrorists involved in the bombing because the tail light in his car is out. And this ends up being the big break and arresting him for the bombing. And pretty much the exact same thing happened in real life years after this book was written, when Tim McVeigh was stopped by an Oklahoma State trooper named Charlie Hanger right after the Oklahoma City bombing because Tim McVeigh was driving a car without a rear license plate. And this ended up leading to his arrest for the Oklahoma City bombing. And there are over 20 details like this in the book that mirror the Oklahoma City bombing and some other events that happened in the mid 1990s. But by far, the most curious thing about this book is that it was written by Martin Keating. And Martin Keating just happened to be the brother of Frank Keating, who almost unbelievably was governor of Oklahoma when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. And right after the bombing happened, there were some articles talking about how just incredibly strange it was that the brother of the Oklahoma governor wrote this book years before the Oklahoma City bombing with a bunch of similarities to what ended up happening. And Martin Keating himself gave some interviews where he talked about the coincidences, quote unquote, with his book. And I'll go ahead and play a clip from one of those interviews here, real quick.
Tell us a little bit about the premise of this book.
Well, this book is what the FBI truly fears. This is the book that was finished in 1991 that predicted a number of things that have happened since then. It's the coming to America of foreign terrorists establishing a base in America.
You know, there are some really quirky coincidences, particularly with the Oklahoma City bombing. For example, the name of the character.
Well, you mean the Tom McVeigh character in my book versus Tim McVeigh in real life? That, of course, was totally coincidental. But there is a scene in which a OHP, Oklahoma High Patrol trooper, stops a suspicious vehicle for a flickering taillight, and he makes a discovery which he doesn't understand fully the significance of at the time, which breaks open the case. Well, of course, that happened in real life with Charlie Hanger, who stopped Tim McVeigh. And there are a number of parallels, and as a result, a number of people on the internet and on shortwave broadcasts have been saying that I was somehow involved in this, and then they attempted to.
That's got to be hard for you, Martin.
It's ridiculous, but they've implicated by their references. My brother Frank also. They've claimed that he's
governor of Oklahoma.
They claim he's in cahoots with me, and somehow, it's nonsense. But these people can say what they want to say, I guess.
And he actually gave another interview that's even more curious than this one, because he was also interviewed on a local news broadcast on the exact day of the Oklahoma City bombing, just right after it happened. And I'll play some clips from that interview right now, and then I'll talk about why I find this interview so suspicious.
Today's bombing in Oklahoma City was predicted by an Oklahoma author. Martin Keating, brother of the governor, is finishing up a book about terrorism in the heartland. This afternoon, he spoke with OETA's Karen Wicker in our Tulsa studio.
Mr. Keating, thanks for joining us. You have just recently written a novel about a terrorist attack here in Oklahoma.
Yes, the terrorists are based in Oklahoma, and it's sad that it came true today.
Well, from the information we know now, would you say this does have the fingerprints of a terrorist attack?
It is a terrorist attack. It's a strike at America's soul. And it's appropriate that they struck at Oklahoma City because that's the heart of America psychologically and geographically.
The book you wrote is called The Final Jihad. For folks out there at home that aren't familiar with that word, that means holy war. Right?
Yes, and that's what we have. It's a group of people, whether they're associated with any Middle Eastern crowd or not, it's a group of people who want to do damage to America. And they've done a lot because there'll be a lot of people going to work tomorrow who will not be comfortable.
You have some interesting parallels here in your book with what happened today. Your book starts out at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport,
Yes.
which is now, we know, the place where the rental car
Yes.
was taken from.
Yes, and I also predicted the World Trade Center bombing because that would be a gorgeous thing to bring down. If from their perspective, I use that term gorgeous advisedly.
So I find this whole interview just incredibly suspicious because, as mentioned on the broadcast, this interview took place on the exact day of the Oklahoma City bombing, just a few hours after it happened. And what's suspicious is that Martin Keating's book hadn't even been released when he gave this interview. He'd written the book, he finished it in 1991, but it hadn't been published. It wasn't published until 1996. So the question is, well, if the book wasn't even published, how did the news network even know to bring Martin Keating onto the broadcast and interview him about his book that, again, wasn't even published? It was just basically sitting on his computer at the time. And this interview also happened just a few hours after the bombing. So this interview would have had to have been set up just almost immediately after the bombing to get him on there in such a short amount of time. So for this interview to happen about this book that wasn't even published or available to the public is very odd. And he also mentions in this interview how it wasn't just the Oklahoma City bombing that he predicted in his book. He wrote of the World Trade Center being bombed, and this did happen in 1993. He also wrote of a TWA flight being blown up by terrorists with a shoulder-launched missile. And in 1996, a TWA flight crashed off the coast of New York, killed everybody on board, and there is a whole bunch of evidence that this plane was actually blown up by a missile. And he also wrote about an Amtrak train being derailed by terrorists. And in 1995 in Arizona, an Amtrak train was sabotaged and crashed, and it was attributed to a terrorist attack. And in his interview, he talks about some of these other similarities in his book as well.
Now, how long ago did you start this book?
1988.
1988. Now, tell us about some of these amazing parallels. They've been reported on CNN and then again on headline news to the Oklahoma City bombing and then the World Trade Center. First, the Oklahoma City bombing.
Well, I had about, a dozen or so events that I wrote in 1988 that came true afterwards. But when Oklahoma City happened, it was as much a shock to me as it was to everybody else. And I had a friend who had read my book and who called me and said, "My gosh, it's your book." I also had the fall of the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev's resignation, airplane that crashed into the White House, Amtrak derailment, a number of things that have happened. Mm-hmm. And that's a little bit spooky, but on the other hand, it's what I have gleaned from these intelligence sources that there are likely things such as that, and there are a lot more in the book, that the intelligence people I've contacted feel are going to happen to this country.
We mentioned also connections to or parallels to the attack on the World Trade Center. What were those parallels?
Well, it's exact parallel. I had named the World Trade Center as a probable source of a terrorist attack, or the probable locus of a terrorist attack.
Now, when he was asked about this, Martin Keating claimed that he knew terrorism experts in Washington, D.C., and he had some very high-up intelligence sources in the FBI. And he interviewed these people for his book, and through these interviews, he learned what type of terrorist attacks the FBI was concerned about happening in America. So he claims he used what he learned from his FBI sources in his book, and these FBI predictions about what might happen in the U.S. were pretty much spot on. And that's why his book predicted so many things accurately.
You did a lot of research for your book.
Yes.
From what you found out during your research, is any of this ringing true with what we're seeing today?
Yes, my research started about 6 years ago, and the FBI was very concerned when I met with them in Washington about something like this. When you have terrorism taking place within our shores, not necessarily along the coastlines, say at New York or other cities like that, they were concerned that there could be terrorists among us.
So you can believe that if you want. It is definitely true that the Keating family was extremely connected. Their uncle, who Martin Keating dedicated his book to, was at one point the worldwide head of the U.S. Navy's intelligence collection operations and counterintelligence activity. And Martin Keating's brother, Frank Keating, has quite the background. Before he became governor of Oklahoma, he was an FBI agent, and he had a number of very high positions in the Reagan administration, including Associate Attorney General in the Department of Justice, where he oversaw a bunch of federal agencies like the Secret Service and the ATF and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So he was very connected and was definitely just way more than some random politician who became governor of Oklahoma. So the whole thing is just very, very strange, especially the mystery of Tom McVeigh, Tim McVeigh, and the similarities in the cars being pulled over by an Oklahoma State trooper after a federal building is bombed. And the fact that this book was written by the brother of the Oklahoma governor is really the strangest fact of it at all. And next up is 1996's The Eyes of Darkness by Dean Koontz, and this one became a big deal during COVID-19 when it was discovered that this book talks about a virus named Wuhan 400 that was created in a lab in Wuhan, China, and it would be released in public to cause a global pandemic. And that basically mirrors the official story of COVID-19. The official story of COVID-19 tells us that the virus originated from a lab leak in Wuhan, China. Who knows if that is even indeed the truth, but that's the official story at least. So for this book to mention a virus that originated in Wuhan and is intended to cause a global pandemic, and to mention this decades before COVID-19 happened, it's very curious. And you may already be familiar with this. It was mentioned a lot on social media and the internet when it was first discovered during COVID. But there's another super strange detail with this book and the Wuhan virus that I don't really see mentioned much at all, and it is incredibly suspicious. And I'll give a shout out here to one of my favorite YouTube channels, Mitch from Interesting Books Reviewed. Definitely recommend his channel 1,000,000%. And he actually just did a book review of this book, and he mentioned a very odd fact with this book that I hadn't really seen mentioned anywhere else. So he actually has an original copy of the book, The Eyes of Darkness. The book originally came out in 1981, and Dean Koontz used the pen name Lee Nichols, and then it was republished in 1996 under the name Dean Koontz. But the incredibly strange thing is that in the original 1981 book, there is no mention of Wuhan. Instead, in the original version of the book, the virus is named Gorky 400, and it's created in a lab outside of the city of Gorky, Russia. And then for whatever reason, when the book was republished in 1996, they decided to change the name of the virus to Wuhan 400 and change its story to being created in a lab in Wuhan. And this is just really strange because it's such a minor detail in the book. Nothing else really changed from the first edition to the second edition. The plot didn't change. The major details of the book didn't change. The only thing that really changed was the name of the virus and where it originated. And obviously, it is incredibly strange that they changed the details of the virus to the exact city where we're told COVID-19 originated from decades later. So the whole similarities of the virus in this book and COVID-19, that's definitely interesting, but I really find it suspicious that, for whatever reason, someone felt the need to change the location of the virus to Wuhan for this book's second edition. And next up is Kerry Thornley's The Idle Warriors, and this book is one of those quirky little strange facts about the JFK assassination. So the author of the book is Kerry Thornley, and he's quite an interesting guy. He was one of the founders of Discordianism, which was this really bizarre religion/philosophy that was popular for a stretch in the 1960s. But more interestingly, before he founded Discordianism, Kerry Thornley was in the Marines, and he served with Lee Harvey Oswald in 1959. And for reasons that are a little vague, he decided to write a novel about Lee Harvey Oswald, which he named The Idle Warriors. And this was 1959, so obviously this was years before the Kennedy assassination. So this book is considered the only thing written about Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. And it's always been a real mystery as to why he wrote a book about this just kind of random guy who was just a normal person at the time, and who years down the road just happens to be the guy accused of assassinating the president. It's definitely one heck of a coincidence, quote unquote. There's a research associate at the JFK Museum in Dallas who has this quote here. He says, "I've always wondered why Thornley would write about what appears to be just a common Marine. I always found that odd." And people were very curious and suspicious of Kerry Thornley writing a novel about Oswald before the assassination, and the Warren Commission actually questioned Kerry Thornley about his relationship to Oswald, which, not surprisingly, nothing really came of this testimony because, as you probably know, the Warren Commission was seemingly not very interested in uncovering the truth about the JFK assassination. They seemed to be more focused on covering up that truth. But more interesting is that Jim Garrison was very convinced that Kerry Thornley knew a lot more than he was telling about the assassination, and in fact, he thought Kerry Thornley might have been one of the Oswald doubles. In the months before the assassination, and even on the day of the JFK assassination, there was a person or even a group of people in New Orleans and Dallas, and these people resembled Lee Harvey Oswald, and in some cases, they even identified themselves as Lee Harvey Oswald. And these Oswald doubles muddied the waters of the investigation because there were all these conflicting reports of people who'd seen or interacted with someone that they thought was Oswald. And Jim Garrison actually charged Kerry Thornley with perjury and issued a warrant for his arrest because Kerry Thornley told the Warren Commission that he hadn't seen Lee Harvey Oswald since the late 1950s, and Jim Garrison claimed that that was a lie because there were multiple people who claimed that they'd seen Kerry Thornley and Oswald together in the time before the Kennedy assassination. There was this neighbor of Oswald's named Myrtle Lasavia, and she has this quote here. She says, "Her husband and a number of people who live in that neighborhood saw Thornley at the Oswald residence a number of times. In fact, they saw him there so much they did not know which was the husband, Oswald or Thornley." So Jim Garrison issued a warrant for Kerry Thornley's arrest, and the story of what happened with this warrant is interesting because in a roundabout way, it involves Harry Connick Jr., and I actually made a video about this odd connection a few months ago. I'll link it in the description, but the quick recap is that Jim Garrison's position as New Orleans District Attorney was an elected office. He had to be reelected every 2 years, and right as he was trying to get Kerry Thornley arrested, he had to run for reelection in the 1972 election. And his opponent was Harry Connick Sr., Harry Connick Jr.'s dad. And in what was described as a stunning upset, Jim Garrison lost his district attorney position to Harry Connick Sr. And as the new district attorney, Harry Connick Sr. inherited all of Jim Garrison's research and investigations, and he did absolutely nothing with any of it. He didn't pursue any of the investigations at all. And not only that, but in 1991, one of Connick's co-workers claimed he'd been ordered by Harry Connick to burn filing cabinets of Jim Garrison's research that were in the New Orleans District Attorney's office. So it was just a total sabotage of Jim Garrison's investigation, and Harry Connick Sr. also dropped the perjury charge against Kerry Thornley, and nothing ever came of the arrest warrant. And honestly, this whole Harry Connick Sr. story is just wild. He played one of the biggest parts of anyone in covering up the JFK assassination, and there's also way more controversies that he was involved in too. Definitely check out this video if you're interested in it. It's a pretty good one. And then there's also a couple interesting side notes to Kerry Thornley's story. The first is that after he testified to the Warren Commission, they subpoenaed his book and put it in the National Archives. So it wasn't published at the time, and there were just rumors and talks of how strange it was that someone actually wrote a book about Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. Then in 1991, Kerry Thornley's book was finally released. And then later in his life, he also claimed that both he and Lee Harvey Oswald were subjected to the government's MK Ultra mind control programming while they served in the Marines together. So The Idle Warriors by Kerry Thornley. Definitely Kerry Thornley's a real interesting guy, and just very, very strange that there's this book written about Oswald before the assassination. And then last up is a series of books written by Ingersoll Lockwood in the late 1800s, and the similarities of these books to the presidency of Donald Trump are definitely interesting. And you're probably familiar with a lot of this. It gained a lot of attention when it was first discovered a few years ago. And the first book is a Wizard of Oz-like children's book named Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump, which was released in 1889. And then another book in the series came out in 1893, Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey, and the title character of the books is Wilhelm Heinrich Sebastian von Trump, who goes by Baron Trump, and obviously Baron Trump is the name of Donald Trump's youngest child, and the Baron Trump in the book is a very rich child who lives in Castle Trump in New York City, and Baron Trump was a very rich child who grew up in Trump Tower in New York City. And in the second book, Baron Trump follows a wise mentor who goes by the name Don, who's called the Master of all Masters and the wisest man alive. So those are the two Baron Trump books, but the really interesting book by Ingersoll Lockwood is 1900 or The Last President, which was published in 1896. And it's about an outsider politician from New York who's elected president in a total upset, and this sends Manhattan into just chaos with mobs in the streets and people rioting. And this is pretty much identical to Trump's election in 2016. He was an outsider candidate from New York. It was considered an upset when he won the election, and there were a whole bunch of protests in the street after his election. And in the book, the quote-unquote hotel on Fifth Avenue in New York will be the location where the mob starts, and Trump Tower is a hotel on Fifth Avenue where a lot of these protests were held. And the novel also mentions a Pence who's in the administration of the president, which is obviously the name of Trump's vice president. So another very strange coincidence. So there's some real interesting parallels here. I was very curious if Trump has ever been asked about this and what his thoughts are. I know if I found some just random novels that were written hundreds of years ago that had a bunch of parallels to my life, I'd probably be a little freaked out. But as far as I could tell, Trump has never been asked about this or he's never commented about the Ingersoll Lockwood books. And there's plenty of theories out there about these books and Ingersoll Lockwood and whether this is all just a big coincidence or whether there's something more going on here. One of the more interesting theories has to do with time travel, saying that these books were written by someone who could see into the future or even visit the future. Then they wrote these books based on what they saw when Trump took office, which is definitely a concept that's pretty far out there and tough to wrap your mind around. But it is interesting to look at Donald Trump's uncle, John Trump, who was an MIT professor, and he was apparently just a genius electrical engineer. He was involved in like really advanced projects like particle accelerators and things like that. And the real interesting thing is that after Nikola Tesla died, the FBI had John Trump go through Nikola Tesla's papers to make sense of some of the notes that he left about his project. And so this time travel theory goes that Nikola Tesla was secretly working on time travel, and John Trump found a bunch of notes about time travel, and instead of turning over the papers, John Trump kept them, and then he shared the secret with his nephew Donald Trump. So it's definitely an interesting thing to consider. It's very odd that it wasn't just the Baron Trump books that have some similarities to Donald Trump, but also the Last President book. It'd be one thing if it was just one book or one reference here and there that had some similarities, but to have multiple books that have all these similarities to Donald Trump, it's definitely curious. So I'd definitely love to hear your thoughts on what you think is going on here. Sometimes you'll see people say it's predictive programming, which is basically normalizing something like a terrorist attack or a pandemic so people aren't just totally shocked or overwhelmed when something like that happens in real life because they've been familiarized with it through books or movies, which definitely could be the case for some of the things that you see. I also think that people who plan out these large scale things like major world events, I think a lot of times they look to books or even movies for ideas or basically for inspiration. And the CIA actually has the largest library in the world of espionage novels, and apparently employees will go to this library and browse through these novels to get ideas for intelligence operations and the things that they're planning. And this could be why there's sometimes similarities in things that happen in real life and things that have been written about, because the people who are planning out these real life events will use novels and movies to get ideas. So I do think it could be a case of that as well. And there are plenty more examples than the ones I talked about in this video. And then lastly, just wanted to end the video here by giving a big shout out to the members here on YouTube and the supporters on Patreon. Thank you so very much for your support. I truly, truly appreciate it. It definitely really means a lot to me. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon with another one.